The Russian military is failing badly at the moment in Ukraine. That is very, very clear. And in this current phase, of course, the discussion shifts towards the topic of nuclear weapons. So you see a lot of media people and politicians and think tank experts and so on. They mold the idea what the Russians might do. Could they use smaller tactical nuclear weapons? And how would this warfare proceed, and what would the response be? So many people talk about this, but their source material is always more or less the same. It's a bunch of assessments that go back to the Cold War, and most of these assessments have something to do with the RAND Corporation. Now RAND has been very, very important for this, because starting in 1961, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense of the United States, was hiring civilians from organizations such as RAND to develop nuclear war strategies. So this sounds a bit odd, because many people that were hired were experts in economics or political science. Why would you get these people to design a nuclear war strategy? Now, of course, leading a war has a lot to do with the economics of warfare and how to sell that war, how to make sure that your own population will go along with that. But it's pretty notable that these RAND people had a special status. They were called the whiz kids, right? You had a guy called William Kaufman. He had studied international studies at Yale. He was teaching at Princeton, so this is kind of the elite level of American empire universities. And you had a guy called Alan Enthoven. He had a Rhodes Scholarship from the British colonial empire to study at Oxford. And of course, this led to a lot of criticism. The journalist Fred Kaplan had his book out called The Wizards of Armageddon. And he said that these civilian strategists are just theorists. They don't have access to all the data, especially, important secret data, and they're not capable of really developing these strategies. Now, of course, the argument was that these are some of the smartest people in the country, and they should have a say in this. You don't want just generals developing a strategy, because, as we know, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But there's a lot more to it. So obviously these smart people from the RAND Corporation and other think tanks, they figured that there's no real way of waging nuclear war that actually works, no matter how you twist it and turn it, this topic. So nobody could solve this dilemma, right? There were two superpowers at the time, and even if you have conventional warfare at first, this conventional warfare will eventually fail because it is too expensive, and there's just not enough power behind it, right? You have to make a complicated airplane or a complicated tank to deliver a conventional warhead, and it has to hit the target precisely to cause meaningful damage. That kind of warfare is just very, very expensive and not sustainable. So then, even if you move over to smaller tactical nuclear weapons, that doesn't solve your problem either, because if the other side has them too, what's going to happen? Of course, there's an escalation, and then you have either more nuclear weapons used or other weapons such as biological or chemical weapons. So that's not a solution either. And many, many experts played out these scenarios on paper. You had these university people doing this together with the generals, and they came from different backgrounds. And sometimes the generals would tell these university guys, "What the heck do you know about all this?" And the response was, "Well, I've been involved in just about as many nuclear wars as you have, Mr. General," meaning none. So these people were smart enough to take the next logical steps in their scientific analysis. What is the only thing that would really benefit the superpowers? Two at the time, Soviet Union and America. or let's say the Anglo-American Empire, what is the only thing that makes sense? What is the only real use of nuclear weapons? Well, the only reasonable, rational thing to do is to form a secret cartel of the superpowers and then use these nuclear weapons either to keep competitors in line. So in case the Japanese want to play empire again, or the French, or the Turks, or whatever. So you can defend yourself, you defend your status against these other competitors. And another way of using nuclear weapons would be in a cartel scenario. A useful idea would be to have a limited use of nuclear weapons just to increase the drama. Right, a secret cartel and a secret plan to use a few nukes here and a few nukes there to make everybody believe that the superpowers are really serious. The superpowers are serious about destroying each other, even though it makes no sense, in the era of atomic weapons. You see, these Rand guys and other guys, they had scenarios on paper where America uses 100 warheads against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union uses 100 warheads. And then somehow the political leadership or the military guys, they would be on a special phone line and say, well, we'll promise each other we're just going to use 100 nukes each side. Well, then you'd have 100 valuable targets destroyed on each side, and then what? The conflict can go on, and both sides, both superpowers would weaken each other to a degree where they could lose their superpower status. They could become so weak that they get then attacked by Japan, for example. The Russians, they have a long and complicated history with Japan. The Japanese, they want an empire. Again, they need space to put people, and Russia has a lot of space. And the Turks once ruled the Islamic world, the Islamics' grand power, the caliphate, and they had a really successful run, expansionist run. But at some point, the caliphate was defeated through espionage mostly, and then the power over Islam transferred back to Arab tribes, not Turks anymore. So what if the Turks want to be an empire again? It makes no sense for the superpowers, and now we have 3 of them. It makes no sense for them to truly just try to destroy each other. Makes much more sense to form a secret cartel and then to use a couple of nukes here and a couple of nukes there to create more drama. So the single most rational scenario for the superpowers, and this is the one scenario that nobody will ever talk about. I mean, some people dare to talk about it in some way. For example, Professor Carroll Quigley, he mentioned it in one of his books. He called the Cold War pretty much fake because a true fight would make no sense, and you saw kind of this trade going on between the East and the West, and technology sales and all that. So what was the point of these Rand people? Was the point to create a smokescreen to make people not understand the situation, not understand nuclear war? So almost anybody nowadays you hear talking about this issue of nuclear war with Russians and in Ukraine and stuff, everybody is reverting back to these talking points from the Rand Corporation. And there's another way to create a smokescreen. It is to paint the other side as irrational. So, for example, NATO media or NATO-affiliated Western media, they portray Vladimir Putin as irrational, like as if this one guy could make these decisions. And he was supposedly driven by the desire to be more powerful and more this and more that. And from this, out of this mood, he attacked Ukraine. So that's kind of this explanation that is given. And on the other hand, Putin, in his speech recently about the annexation of conquered territories in Ukraine, Putin painted the US government or the US establishment as Satanist and crazy, as if they wanted nothing more than a third world war. It can't really be won. So this is kind of a technique used to confuse people. Superpowers are very, very rational. They plan ahead decades in advance or even a century in advance, and they do things for specific reasons. And so, it would be possible to have a cartel and to use a couple of nuclear weapons in Ukraine or in Asia to scare the whole world. So what would happen then would be everybody is clinging towards either the Americans or the Russians or the Chinese and hoping that this empire would protect them against the other empires. Then another smokescreen tactic. Is this discussion about smaller tactical nuclear weapons. We saw this as early as 1957 with Henry Kissinger's book, Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. So they pretended they could solve this dilemma by saying we're going to use small nuclear weapons and we're just going to use a few of them. But that doesn't really solve the dilemma. Not at all. And so this is something you have to keep in mind. Now, these assessments from the experts are not completely useless. If you take some of these old RAND documents or whatever, they describe the problems of nuclear warfare, especially limited nuclear warfare. So it's not as simple as just firing 100 small warheads against targets, because you don't necessarily hit a lot of things, or you don't destroy a lot of troops, right? And some structures of the enemy, they may be specially protected. For example, North Korea has built a very sophisticated bunker system, and they have all kinds of weapons and even airplane runways inside of mountains or in the side of a mountain. So everything is geared towards a nuclear war, and even if the other side fires nuclear weapons, it doesn't really necessarily affect your own structures and troops. And so using 2-3 weapons in Ukraine would not solve Russia's problems. Yeah, nuclear weapons are fairly cheap. It's a lot of bang for the buck. The Americans at some point had nailed it down. They had this industrial complex established. And so one ready-made nuclear warhead or nuclear weapon became as cheap as $250,000. So that's much less than an airplane, much less than a sophisticated missile, much less than a patrol boat, much less than a tank. So this is something you need to keep in mind. These weapons are ideal for a superpower cartel, but they're not ideal for anything else. Then there's a factor about the Ukrainians that you should be aware of. Ukraine has enough experts and resources to improvise nuclear weapons, improvise chemical weapons, and even biological weapons. So once you have an atomic industry, for atomic power, you have what it takes to make a uranium bomb or to make even a plutonium bomb. The industry people don't like to admit this, but it's everything is very, very close. They might say in public that this is very, very separate and so on and so forth, but history tells us otherwise. A lot of nuclear power plants were used or the infrastructure was used to make plutonium for warheads. So Ukraine might actually fire back with nuclear weapons. They could have improvised these sort of weapons because these day and age, they're not that hard to make. Once you know how to make enriched uranium or you make plutonium, the rest is fairly easy. And chemical weapons are fairly easy. These chemical production methods are well known and very efficient methods, so you can cook up some chemicals that way to respond. And biological weapons are also fairly simple. Usually when people think about biological weapons, they think of these movie-like pandemics, where everybody infects everyone and people just die. And of course, these weapons exist, but usually the weapon of choice would be something like bacteria that incapacitates the enemy, that is not contagious from person to person. That way you could saturate an area and make people sick, unable to fight, and that would then be an easy operation to take over these territories and to do a cleanup afterwards. Or the pathogen has already evaporated and died off. That can be improvised fairly quickly. I mean, you have books such as The Biology of Doom, where you see, based on declassified documents, how Britain, for example, started its biological weapons program. They used simple buildings, sheds, and they used these stainless steel milk containers, because they had these the spigots and the faucets and all that stuff, and you could easily clean them after usage. And they had the right size, so in a simple shed with these milk containers, you can actually make sizable amounts of pathogens, and you could fill them into munitions that you already have. This is what the Americans did for a long time. Wasn't the most efficient way. A lot of the pathogens actually burned up in the explosion, but you could cluster together these munitions and have then a cluster pathogen bomb. So this is something Ukrainians could actually improvise. And then something else that you need to be aware of is the possibility of a false flag operation by Russia or by anybody else. So, as I said, all you need is about 100 pounds of highly enriched uranium to make a bomb. Or you need about 20 pounds of plutonium to make a plutonium bomb. It's easy to make the bomb once you have the materials. So anybody could make sort of an unmarked, unregistered nuclear weapon and use that weapon, and then claim somebody else did that. Right? This is something that people are warning about, or have been warning about for a while. The Russians are not beyond this sort of tactic, improvising a nuke, deploying it on Russian territory or Russian-held territories, and kill a bunch of people, like 10,000, 50,000 people, and then use that as a jumping board to attack Ukraine with nuclear weapons. So even if that happens and Ukraine surrenders or whatever, what's then left for Russia to take over? What if the industrial parks are being destroyed in Ukraine during a retreat? What if millions and millions of Ukrainians flee to the European Union? What's left for the Russians to take over? Some territory, of which they already have more than enough. And that, of course, would not even begin to decide the question of the larger conflict between the superpowers. We still hear so-called conservative voices in the West, conservative people telling us that we should abandon Ukraine, that this is none of our business, that this is a waste of time. And oftentimes these sentiments are driven by the false impression that Russia is now conservative, or even a conservative ally against the Chinese and communists. Clearly, there may be an alliance, or maybe there already has been a deeper alliance between Russia and China. The true relationship between these countries is somewhat secret. You can reconstruct it, and pretty much Russia took over China with the communists. Same as in Eastern Europe, but for strategic reasons in Asia and China and North Korea, it was claimed that these Asian countries were sort of independent. Communist brothers, comrades, sure, but separate. Like its own, like they are their own things. And so this argument of we need the Russians against world communism, really doesn't work at all. And then, of course, you have this issue that there's a Democrat in the White House, and the whole war may serve the Democratic Party more than it serves the Republicans. So the quicker the war is over, some Republicans think, the better for the Republican Party in upcoming elections. So abandoning Ukraine is something that people are calling for. Now, if Ukraine was a country situated in Africa, many people really wouldn't care that much, because that's far away from everything, and why should we get involved? But it's right between Western Europe, or let's say Central Europe, and the Eastern Bloc. It's right there. So the Russians can claim it's in front of our doorstep. We can have NATO move up to our doorstep, and the European Union, which is NATO, the most part of the European Union, can say we can't have the Russians move that close to our borders. And now we see that the North Korean state is fully geared for war, even nuclear war. They have up to 2 million troops that they can deploy, and they can send 250,000 of those to Ukraine. And then we have communist Asians here in Europe. And you could also have a larger war in Asia. And we see that big papers, big media is already telling the story of how China is acting out of desperation because they're in trouble and they have to take Taiwan to get things going again, to get things jump-started and such. And the overarching message relayed to the audience is that the Americans couldn't have done a significantly better job. They just, kept things moving, and suddenly they get surprised by the actions of Russia in Ukraine or China attacking Taiwan. In reality, these things are pre-planned a long time ago, and a cartel is the most useful thing the superpowers can actually do. So China, as a superpower, was built with Western technology and access to Western markets. So when a conflict starts, you can't play dumb. You can't feign innocence. And same thing with the Russians. For over 100 years, Western technology has built the Russian Empire. So you can't play dumb now. You can't just tell people to go along with everything. And you can't tell people to shut up about NATO, and to can't keep people from criticizing the Western Empire. So this is the most likely scenario: secret cartel of superpowers, and this is the one scenario that nobody wants or can talk about.